Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tizengauzen. Today, December 14th, we have a very interesting episode. So, in this episode, in Russia, a general who reported to Putin about the capture of Kupiansk has disappeared somewhere, and for that he received the Hero of Russia star. Trump's team has arrived in Berlin. So what exactly did they bring to these negotiations with Volodymyr Zelenskyy? And why does the peace plan now look rather dubious, like a deal with a troubled asset? A very nervous reaction from the Russian delegation to possible amendments to this plan. Strikes on oil depots, refineries, and thermal power plants. The demilitarization of the Russian Federation continues. And we'll also talk about the terrorist attack in Sydney as a reminder that you shouldn't negotiate with terrorists. Why is Lukashenko handing over political prisoners to Ukraine? And what is he afraid of? And about the era of deals with dictators. Where could the world be heading right now? All this and more in today's episode. There will be a lot of interesting things. So if this is your first time on this channel, welcome, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. And let's start with this piece of news. Colonel General Sergei Kuzovlev has disappeared somewhere in Russia. Rumor has it that he may have not survived. The thing is, it was this very general who reported to Putin that Kupiansk was completely under Russian control. He made this report back on November 20th, and already by December 9th, for this very report, and for the fact that Kupiansk was supposedly fully under Russian control, he received the Hero of Russia star from Putin himself, from this 1.5 meter tall conqueror. On December 9th, they celebrated Heroes' Day in Russia, as it's called, and on this day, old Kabayev traditionally hands out Russia's highest award, the Hero of Russia star. So he was there with a glass of champagne, Putin absolutely beaming like a samovar, practically oozing Botox from joy that Kupiansk had been taken. But in the end, it turned out that things were not like that at all. That is, let me remind you, the armed forces of Ukraine carried out a successful counterattack and practically kicked the Russians out of Kupiansk. Right now, they're clearing the buildings of them. I think that very soon there won't be a trace of those orcs left in our Kupiansk. Over the past couple of months, this general has regularly appeared on screen, reporting the situation on the front line to the bald scoundrel. Well, and Russian telegram channels are saying that the general is no longer getting in touch. I think that, at best, for him at best, there will be a place found. Somewhere in a detention center in the near future. Just imagine, on November 20th, he lied to Putin, saying that Kupiansk was completely under control. They also claimed there, then Gerasimov started lying further, the chief of the general staff, that supposedly 6,000 Ukrainian servicemen are surrounded, and now everything will be taken care of. So, and then Putin went even further. Putin started lying that since November 4th, Kupiansk has been under control. Well, basically, just like in a game of telephone, they kept passing it on to each other, and each time it got even more distorted. So, in general, I think we might not see the general again, and that's just fine. Maybe somewhere they'll pour him some tea with Novichok in it. Well, it's only natural, only natural. Let's take an example. For example, at the negotiations, representatives of Donald Trump, Mr. Witkoff and Kushner, arrived in Berlin where talks with Zelenskyy on a peace plan are to take place. Western media report that at this meeting there will be strong pressure on the Ukrainian leadership to accept the plan. But there are some nuances there. Previously, the Ukrainian side stated that it considered the mutual withdrawal of troops in Donbass as one of the options for settlement. That is, in Trump's plan, let me remind you, there is no mutual withdrawal of troops. Well, more precisely, let's put it this way. In the clause that the Russians inserted there, there is no mutual withdrawal of troops. So basically, Russia just verbally, or maybe on paper somewhere, guarantees that they won't bring their army into the territory from which Ukrainian troops withdraw. Oh, what generosity, right? Unbelievable. But in reality, they control this territory. Ukraine is supposed to unilaterally withdraw its troops from fortified positions, to pull back from the lines that have been established there since 2014, and the Russians say, well, we won't bring our troops in there. I think that it's just that, plain and simple, there will be yet another batch of so-called militiamen, tractor drivers, miners, those little green men, it doesn't matter, let's emphasize, Cossacks, someone like that, maybe a Gherkin too will show up, or someone else. Basically, to trust the Russians is to not respect yourself. On the eve, Western media reported that in its amendments to Trump's plan, Ukraine demanded the return of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as well, and under no circumstances. Did it agree to reduce its army? And in addition, there's this point. Ukraine refuses to unilaterally withdraw troops from Donbass. In other words, Putin is saying, give me what I haven't conquered, let them leave. Well, I think that's clear. It's a tense moment. Many people are saying we're approaching the final stretch of negotiations. Some are optimistic, others not so much. Well, let's start with who arrived. Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, so Trump, Kushner, and Trump's friend Witkoff. Golf partner. Jared Kushner is a businessman to his core. It's all about money, 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 money. He's one of the authors of the Abraham Accords in the Middle East. His approach is purely a business deal. He believes that any war can be resolved with money and investments. In other words, he only understands profit. Witkoff, it's the same thing. He's a real estate tycoon. In fact, both Kushner and Witkoff are two major serious realtors. So Trump isn't sending security experts, but deal makers. I think that's clear to everyone. The most dangerous point I noticed is precisely about these troops. Ukraine withdraws its troops from Donbass, and Russia says, we won't send troops in there. No, we've been through this in 2014. We know exactly how this goes. Russian troops will show up there. Then they'll say, that's just how it happened. Remember how Putin used to say, the little green men? That's not us. Come on. That's not the army. And then he would laugh with that nasal, perverse old man's laugh of his and say, well, of course, what did you expect? Behind those little green men were our troops. Yeah, I fooled you all again. So naturally, there's a statement from Ushakov, Putin's aide, saying that they won't accept anything at all. No amendments from Ukraine or Europe. I mean, this is arrogance of the highest order. So Russia submitted its points to the United States, handed them over and said, that's it, no more. No amendments are to be made. That's it, this is how we want it. So, just so you understand, this is an ultimatum not to Kiev but to Trump. Ushakov said that would be unconstructive. We don't want any amendments from Ukraine or Europe in there. So basically Moscow is saying, Trump, we've agreed on everything with you. If you let Zelenskyy or anyone from Europe change anything, there will be no deal. We won't give you this deal. So for some reason, Putin is convinced that Trump is more interested in the success of this deal than Russia itself. In other words, they're openly blackmailing Donald Trump again with the threat of derailing this triumphant peacemaking effort. And Moscow's and Ushakov's hysteria is actually a good sign. If Ushakov is reacting so nervously to amendments from Ukraine, it means they're afraid that Trump, under the influence of Ukraine's arguments or some other arguments, might change his position. This has happened before. Remember when Trump even surprised Putin by imposing sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil? Of course, there was a clear business interest behind it, but it was very painful. It hit their wallets and the war budget. And regarding security guarantees, with all due respect, of course, but how can you trust some paper security guarantees? I mean, from Ukraine's side, if the previous security guarantees, by the way, neither Russia nor the United States fulfilled them. Those very guarantees in exchange for which we gave up nuclear weapons. So how can we trust new ones? Or are we supposed to say, well, those don't count, those were just for show? Back then you were just playing around, you gave up your nuclear weapons, everything was taken from you, but it was just a game. But now there will be real proper guarantees. And as for guarantees from the Russian Federation, I won't even comment. I mean, the suitcase Führer, he lies most of his life. And what's more, he lies and immediately believes his own lies. That's just how he is, of course. He really does have that trait. He lies and even revels in how beautifully and convincingly, in his opinion, he lies. And then, on top of that, a very unpleasant event happened for the Russians, at the worst possible moment for them, right in the middle of negotiations. There was a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kupiansk, and the Russians were driven out from there. Well, I've already talked about this. In other words, this is a major geopolitical turning point. The operation in Kupiansk didn't just liberate territory, it wiped out Putin's main bargaining chip. So is it a myth? About invincibility and constant forward movement. Putin kept selling this idea to Trump. We're invincible, we're about to advance, we're only moving forward, Ukraine is incapable of anything. And then there was a collapse of this whole sales pitch to Trump. By the way, even before this, Trump had said that Russia wasn't really advancing, and he called Putin a paper tiger. The Russians spent months preparing this beautiful folder for Trump. That is the essence of their presentation, which they were supposed to bring to the negotiations now, was that Ukraine is falling apart. We're pushing along the entire front. Resistance is useless. Donald, your only job is to formalize our victory. And that's it. You'll be the peacemaker. Well, in other words, to use the language of Trump and the realtors who came with him, they hate it when someone tries to sell them something. This is a damaged asset, and now it turns out the folder fell apart right before their eyes. The armed forces of Ukraine are capable of launching a counteroffensive, a successful one, and Putin has been juggling this Kupiansk thing for the past month. And then he gets such a juicy, straight-up slap in the face. I can just picture it. The person who landed it, his whole hand is full of Botox. He just delivered it so sharply. And you know, what's also important to understand here? That Trump respects strength and despises losers? I don't know which one more. And if someone pretends to be something they're not, a macho guy, tries to sell that image to Trump, but in reality, it turns out he's actually a loser and lies to Trump, well, then you might get called something even worse than a paper tiger. And remember, Putin was telling Trump this summer. Trump gave him 50 days. An ultimatum that there would be a counteroffensive in the summer, that they'd take everything now. But there was no counteroffensive in the summer. All right, then in the fall we'll take Donbass by November. He didn't take it. He didn't take it by December, and before that, not by October either. So he rightfully earns the title of Paper Tiger. He keeps telling Trump that he's about to take it. Well, after Kupiansk, of course, Putin looks like an old, slicked-up liar, someone who might even be deceived by his own generals, someone who is being beaten by the Ukrainians. And for Trump, saving a loser who lies to him, even about taking a city, isn't a good look. That's why a breakdown in the negotiating position could happen. But we don't know what's on the table, and we don't know what's under the table either. That's what's important here. And the whole logic of pressuring Zelenskyy from the peace doves, the peace pterodactyls, whoever you want from the West, was built on the thesis. It's better to negotiate now, because tomorrow will be worse. The Russians are advancing, but it turns out that tomorrow might actually be worse for the Russians, at this rate. And I've also heard the argument that Trump himself doesn't always, to put it mildly, tell the truth. So how is he going to hold Putin accountable for that? So what if he lied? It's no big deal. He's not advancing. No. That's true. Trump, of course, doesn't always tell the truth, but Trump lies in order to win at any cost and achieve victory, while Putin lies in order to hide defeat. These are two very, very different things. And let's definitely remember those thanks to whom the counteroffensive became possible, thanks to whom all of Putin's possible offensives have failed. Absolutely. About our defenders, about our heroes. And I want to remind you about the important fundraising campaigns happening on our channel. Today, we are raising funds to repair equipment for the legendary Freedom of Russia Legion, which is fighting for Ukraine. And the Legionnaires and Caesar have recorded a message for you, the viewers of this channel. Please listen.
Честь имею. Мы, бойцы Легиона Свобода России, обращаемся к зрителям канала Бориса Тизенгаузена. На фронте машина – это жизнь. Это наш шанс добраться до своих, подвести боеприпасы и эвакуировать раненых. Но каждый день мы теряем машину из-за дронов, обстрелов и мин. Сейчас нам нужны средства, чтобы наши колеса снова крутились. Каждый донат – это шанс выжить и бороться дальше. За свободу, за правду.
Also, let me remind you that the Legion carries out missions not only at the front, but also deep behind enemy lines. They disrupt logistics, track down war criminals, and in general, do a lot of useful things. That's why I'm asking you, equipment at the front right now is worth its weight in gold. Let's help the Legionnaires and close this fundraiser for equipment repairs. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to you all, both from myself and from Caesar, and from the Legionnaires and from the hundreds and hundreds of our defenders whom we have already helped together. The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There you'll find Mono, Private, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. And if you don't see the link here, there's a QR code you can always use to access it. Let's help, it's important. Right now, our help is needed at the front more than ever. The demilitarization of Russia continues. The armed forces of Ukraine attacked an oil depot in Uryupinsk. Today, it's a logistics hub located at the junction of the Voronezh, Volgograd, and Rostov regions. It's a transshipment hub. Fuel from there travels along the Moscow-Rostov route, which is a supply artery for the Russian front. But that's not all. In Yaroslavl last night, drones struck the Slavneftianos oil refinery. They also attacked the Afipsky oil refinery in the Krasnodar region, and they hit the Smolenskaya GRES as well. All in all, it was a hot, loud night for Russians. Listen, 3 oil refineries in one night. That's really something. 2 of them were finished off. That is, they struck and then finished them off. That's very good. I always say, if Ukrainian drones don't finish the job the first time, they'll come back as many times as needed. It's simply inevitable. It's a situation where they'll come back and finish the job. So for those working at the Afipsky refinery or anywhere else, you might as well not bother showing up. Your time there is almost up. And yes, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Here, we're not just fighting against Russian propaganda, which Putin spends colossal amounts of money on. We're also exposing their lies. Lies from this dictatorial clique about capturing Kupiansk, about their supposed ability to always go on the offensive, and so on. About how the Russian economy is supposedly doing just fine. We are exposing the lies of this dictatorial clique. So make sure to subscribe. And before important negotiations, Volodymyr Zelenskyy spoke with journalists on his way to Berlin. There are some key statements that I would like to draw your attention to. First of all, he said that he has not yet received a response from the US regarding the peace plan proposal, but the dialogue will begin soon. So, naturally, Kushner and Rutkov decided not to give us any time to prepare in advance. They'll put pressure directly during the negotiations. It's all clear here. That's just how they operate. Their tactic is to push through everything aggressively. Let's do it quickly. But Trump tried to pull this off too, tried to rush things, giving just a week. And here we realize that Trump's plan is not set in stone. It's like clay, not yet a finished vessel. You can still make adjustments to everything. Right now, Trump can give his word or take it back. He can extend the ultimatum or cancel it altogether. That's why we're also making our moves, and the fact that the meeting is taking place in Berlin is part of that. Our allies are there, and I think that will help too. They'll get involved as well. The peace plan won't please everyone, of course. There are a lot of compromises. Vladimir Zelenskyy said this. Well, it's clear they're not preparing us for a completely sweet pill. I think realists have long understood that the borders from 1991 will not be fully and immediately restored now. Russia agreeing to pay reparations, that's not going to happen. I think that's obvious to everyone already. But we'll try to get as much out of them as possible. If the US wants to end this war, it's Russia that has to make compromises, said Vladimir Zelenskyy. Well, that's a passback to Donald Trump. In other words, Zelenskyy is basically saying, Donald, if you only put pressure on Ukraine, that won't be a deal. It will actually be capitulation. So if you want a Nobel Prize, make Putin budge as well. And Kyiv is trying to play on that. Trump probably doesn't want to look like a weak negotiator. And he won't end up looking like one. Right now he's already saying again, or rather not him, but his inner circle, that he might walk away from the negotiations. No. He understands that whether or not he ultimately gets the Nobel Peace Prize depends on this peace agreement. That's why he needs to show that he made Putin back down as well. In other words, that way he'll present himself as strong. And at the end of this framework plan, it's about a ceasefire. Zelenskyy announced this. So, in other words, it's clear here that the Russians are not willing to agree to a ceasefire, not even a partial one. They're only ready to stop firing when all the points they want are fulfilled, when they're approved, and only then will they cease fire. By the way, that's a good question. Trump also called for a ceasefire, but Putin didn't agree to it. Trump said, well, fine, if you don't want to, that's your choice. What kind of negotiations are those?
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
Here's another quote from Volodymyr Zelenskyy regarding Donbass. It's a hot topic. We're making progress. We're holding our positions where we are. The Russians want us to withdraw. America suggests that we withdraw and that Russian troops don't enter. This is what I've already talked about. This is the main trap of Trump's plan. The creation of a gray zone, which in reality will quickly be filled with Russian troops. That is, who will be there? PMC, the Russian National Guard. It doesn't matter. The formula of holding our positions where we are is the only viable option right now. At the moment, just imagine. To hand over to the Russians these entire fortified areas, which have been built up over a long time. For what reason? And tomorrow, they'll push forward from these fortified areas. And is there any logic at all? Why should Ukraine abandon its defensive lines and voluntarily withdraw? Is there any logic here, except for the only one I see, a gift from Trump to Putin, so that he can finally end the war and start doing business with him? I don't see any other justification here. Putin said, like a spoiled child, give me this and then you'll get your deals. But if, before the full-scale invasion, someone had told Russians that Putin would try to pressure Ukraine through the US in the fourth year of the big war so that Ukraine would leave Donbass because Putin's troops can't drive Ukraine out of there, I think Russians definitely wouldn't have believed it. After all, they really thought that fighting Ukraine would be easy. Remember, as a propagandist. Soloviev? Yes, we raise an eyebrow and that's it. That means we're all screwed. They thought that they would be able to drive tanks unhindered all the way to the Polish border and then continue to terrorize Europe. Well, it didn't work out. This is an important statement. If peace efforts fail, Zelenskyy said, we need to pull ourselves together and find another way. In other words, he's saying that we're not desperate. Well, let's put it this way. That's exactly how it sounds. Ukraine is not ready to accept any surrender plan because not all is lost for us. We have other options. And Kupiansk proved that. That is, Ukraine is ready to defend its interests. And it's also signaling to the West. Don't think that without your help, we'll just throw up our hands and give up. That's how it is. If you abandon us, we will act unpredictably, we will act tough, and Ukraine has nothing left to lose. So this is a good signal. Ukraine has already compromised on security guarantees. Instead of NATO membership, there could be bilateral guarantees, Zelenskyy said. Yes, the biggest concession has already been made. So, this point, basically Putin and his delegation can be cornered with this point. In other words, Putin's main argument is being taken away. The war against NATO expansion, the root causes, and so on. Alright, Ukraine gives up on NATO, but Putin continues the war, so the issue isn't NATO. The point is, it's simply that Russia wants to seize land. This is where Russia's position becomes rather shaky when it comes to answering this. Like, what do you actually want? Ukraine is giving up yet again. Yeah, go ahead, stop talking about root causes. There's really only one root cause. I've said this 100 times already. There he is, the bold one, sitting disgustingly somewhere in the Kremlin in 3 different offices. How many of those replicants are running around there, nobody knows. But this root cause needs to be somehow compactly gathered up and sealed off in a bunker. That would be ideal. It would prevent several future wars at once. Well, in general, we're waiting for the results of the negotiations. I don't think there will be any joint statements. They will be very tough. Everyone will go their separate ways and then come together again. There will be a second round, a third, and so on. So, we wait. Now let's move on to international news. I always try to structure the episode so that we revolve around one common theme. And all the topics I'm covering today are precisely about the fact that the world is at a crossroads. Right now, the world could take a wrong turn. And it will do business with terrorists and disregard human life, or it will turn in another direction. In short, a tragedy occurred in Sydney, a bloody terrorist attack at Bondi Beach in Sydney, a popular tourist spot. An event was taking place. The Jewish community had gathered to celebrate the first day of Hanukkah. The event was called Hanukkah by the Sea. There were many people in the crowd, families with children. And suddenly, 2 men dressed in black started shooting, firing directly into the crowd from a pedestrian overpass above the road. Since it was elevated, they had a clear view of where they were shooting and they just started firing indiscriminately into the crowd. 12 people were killed, about 60 wounded. 1 shooter was neutralized, the other was wounded and arrested. So far, no one has claimed responsibility, but the intelligence services of Australia and Israel are investigating the possibility of a foreign connection or sleeper cells of radical Islamists who may have become active due to the events in the Middle East. So one of the terrorists, while he was shooting at people, was approached from behind by a passerby who attacked him and took away his weapon. After that, this terrorist ran away without his weapon. So the one who rushed at this terrorist, selflessly, and he wasn't some bodybuilder, superman or fighter, just an average man, a bit heavyset, about 43 years old. He owns a fruit shop, has 2 children, and he's a Muslim. And he received 2 wounds to his arm. By the way, at first he was mistakenly arrested, but then they realized that he was actually the one taking away the weapon, and he could have been shot. It's still unclear where exactly he got the wound on his arm, because later I saw in the footage, he takes the weapon and walks away with it. That is, they could very well have decided that he was one of the shooters. And so he demonstratively placed the weapon by a tree just in case, so that, God forbid, he wouldn't be shot. But what am I getting at? I'm saying that terrorism doesn't have a skin color. And just look at our unreasonable neighbors. They even claim that we're almost the same people. How is that even possible? If you think we're one people, then why are you killing hundreds of thousands of people? Why are you wiping cities off the face of the earth? Putin used to say that Odessa is a Russian city. Recently, the most massive attack was on Odessa. They launched Kinzhal missiles there, aeroballistic rockets. So Putin doesn't have any people, not at all. There is only him, the emperor, a failed would-be emperor who suddenly decided to go down in history as some kind of land-grabbing conqueror. So you want to annex? Go ahead and annex. Ukraine will bury you in no time. And the main conclusion and consequence, which unfortunately will keep repeating, is that if you let terrorists get what they want, as I say, both those who fire and those who kill hundreds of thousands, then they will keep coming back, demanding even more and killing even more. If we don't punish these people now, this global evil, then other terrorists, because you're not just sending a signal to these terrorists, not just to this dancing dinosaur. Others around the world will say, oh, so that's allowed. It turns out that the US won't hunt with drones like before if they're offered money, resources, rare earth metals. So then you can just kill with impunity. Then, in exchange for some cash or something else from you, they'll even lift the sanctions. I really wouldn't want the whole world to go down the wrong path right now. In other words, it's an era where profit is above everything else. It could get to the point where one not-so-fine day we wake up and there's a price list made for dictators and terrorists. Attacking a free country, this many billions. Destroying a major city, that'll cost this much. Bombing an entire country, here's how much you have to pay for that. Everything will have its own price, and that's terrifying. And here's another piece of news, or rather a very important detail from yesterday's news. Let me remind you that yesterday the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko released 123 political prisoners. Well, it turns out that Lukashenko categorically refused to hand them over to Lithuania or Poland. He handed them over to Ukraine. The political prisoners were met by the head of the main intelligence directorate, Kirilo Budanov. The negotiations were conducted through intelligence channels. In turn, the United States naturally played a key role in the release. And after the release, sanctions on Belarusian potash were lifted. Basically, it was unblocked. Apparently, even transit through Klaipeda was restored. This is what I was talking about. Lukashenko has taken thousands of prisoners hostage and is releasing them in portions in exchange for something. In other words, he is trading. Human lives are just a commodity to him. He trades, and people trade with him, they set a price for him, and they lift sanctions. I've already said this. It will only encourage him to keep arresting more and more prisoners, to have a bigger pool for exchanges. Why did he hand them over to Ukraine? That's an interesting point. First of all, Lukashenko has a pathological hatred for Poland, Lithuania, and their leadership. For him, handing over prisoners across the Polish border is simply humiliating. And then there's the basic element of fear. Lukashenko now sees that Trump, Zelenskyy, and Putin might sign something in the near future. It's possible. There's a chance of that. But Klubnelikov hasn't been invited to a single one of the 100 negotiations. And he tried to squeeze in even on a folding chair, but nobody wants to invite him. And now Lukashenko is trying to wedge himself into this negotiation process, meaning the transfer of political prisoners to Ukraine is a signal. I'm here, I'm an independent player, don't write me off, I can still be useful. The most interesting thing is that Lukashenko also needs security guarantees, and first and foremost from Putin. And also to make sure that no one interferes in the internal processes in the near future, and so that no one gets the idea to stir up the situation inside his country. In other words, he needs guarantees. I just think that the starch baron has probably regretted 100 times already that he got involved with Putin in this adventure. Well, there's no way out. This club of these crazy pensioners, they're all in the same boat. So, as they say, they'll all go down together. Well, friends, take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, and subscribe to this channel. And I really ask you, let's help the Legion, let's help close the fundraiser. The link to the fundraiser is in the description. And thank you so much for that, as always. Wishing us all a peaceful day, and glory to Ukraine.